Malo Elele, and welcome everyone to another live digital kava session here on the Polynesian Eyes podcast. This evening, you have Tuafale coming in from Southern Nevada, Las Vegas, the entertainment capital of the world. We're having a live digital kava session a little earlier than usual in the week. And also Lone Ranger. And again, Mr. Ateroa is still traveling throughout the east and northeast portion of the United States. He's hoping to be back, I believe, next week into the land of the long white cloud. I just realized here that we had not completed our online broadcast here for Patreon. So I'm just going to work on that in the background real quick. But as we go through the motions there to finalize everything on Patreon so that it is running live there, just going to discuss a lot of the support that we've been receiving the last 2 weeks. Appreciate everyone who has gone out of their way to like, share, subscribe to the podcast and to the channel. We've seen tremendous growth, phenomenal growth the last 3 months, and really appreciate everyone's support and comments and shares, as I mentioned. And also, those who also subscribe or became subscribers in the sense of paying members of the channel. Really appreciate that. And if you go to the main page of the channel, there is a join button. In that join button, if you click on that, there are two levels of being a subscriber to the channel, a paid subscriber, a $5 and a $10 subscription level. So that's a great way to contribute. So I appreciate all the followers who pay for that subscription and have that as their support. Also, really appreciate all those who had the super thanks and the super chats. Please feel free to use those. If you have a comment or a question that you want to highlight, or if you just want to throw in a digital kava bag to support the channel, really appreciate that. Appreciate the heads up from some of the viewers who were looking to make their contributions on some of our previous lives, but couldn't find the super chat button. I was able to go in. Somehow it got disabled. And so I believe those should be live or back on and available. The super chats, the super stickers, that should be something that should be available. If you don't see it during the live again, please just give me a heads up. And we probably won't take care of it during this live digital kava session, but I'll dig into it more. But I thought I had addressed it on the last questions that came from the viewers. So this evening, we're going to do two segments. We're looking to have a approximately 2-hour discussion here. And we're going to start off with a discussion on the origin of performing arts in Polynesia. And what I mean by that is it's well documented, the similarities in language and religion throughout Polynesia. In Eastern Polynesia, the North Pacific, and in the South Pacific as well, that we shared a lot of those similarities in how we spoke and how we interacted with each other and the navigation that was experienced by our ancestors. But, due to colonization and certain decisions that were made by our ancestors as they navigated colonization, there seems to be some speeding up of the separation of not only language, and we've discussed the language pretty extensively here on the Polynesian Eyes podcast, that really the groupings of the languages had morphed, and that's really how the Proto-Polynesian languages are grouped, right? Where there's the Samoic and the Tongic family groups, and the Tongic family group is very small. And in the Samoic grouping of languages, it's very large. And some people had, interpreted that data as meaning, oh, look, the Samoan influence throughout Polynesia was much, much more influential and much more widespread. than the Tongan influence. However, when we dug into that study, really the study identified that the Tongan language was actually more true to the Proto Polynesian language than the Samoic languages, and that actually the Samoic languages are grouped together because of because the way that they morphed away from the Proto Polynesian language. So we're going to have an initial discussion on something that a lot of people had identified as the origin of the Tau'olunga and some of the ancient Tongan dances. It's relatively well documented that Tonga fully embraced Christianity and really went through a pattern or a period of looking to organize and to navigate colonization as they were seeing all of our brothers and sisters throughout Polynesia and the Pacific at large, and even the world at large getting colonized. Um, that's something that was a real challenge for our ancestors, and they needed to, essentially say what is the most important things of the civilization that were non-negotiables. What were ways they could navigate uh, the risk of colonization while still maintaining sovereignty and staying in control of their choices as to what things they were willing to, negotiate and concede on, and other things that they were to hold the line on. Water Bears, our official PR rep of the Polynesianized podcast, says Jesus is king. Amen. Malo Toko, appreciate you tuning in and for all the support. Malo. So what we're going to do is we're actually going to watch a short video that came up. I believe one of our viewers had resent this to me on TikTok. Maka Tuihala Maka had shared it and a couple others. And so we marked it to eventually do a reaction to it and have a discussion. So this is um, it is something that is highly debated, and one of the quote unquote receipts that people point to is saying that, hey, Tonga had to pull their dances and a lot of their history and structural basis and behavior from Ha'amoa. And though that is technically true, but it doesn't tell the full story either. But before we jump into it, looks like Island Beast here has a question. He says, fear Tonga will be colonized. What do you think? There's always risk of that, Island Beast. That never goes away. People even say that here in the U.S., right? China holds a lot of debt of the United States. They're our biggest trading partner in regards to imports. Some say that's a very vulnerable position to be in. And so there's that. There's Taiwan. There's, you know, New Caledonia owes a lot of money to China. There are a lot of places out there that colonization is always a risk. And Tonga, I don't think it's in like imminent risk, but it's definitely something that's possible for anyone at any point. So I'm going to bring up this video here real quick, and we'll watch it and kind of react to it real quick, and see where it takes us in the Kava session discussion.
This is the Tau'olunga, one of Tonga's most recognisable dances, usually performed at events by young women either solo or in a large group. And while Tongans are proud of their cultural heritage, it's been pointed out.
This Tau'olunga dance of Tonga was adopted from Samoa many centuries ago.
In the past, scholars have highlighted the Tau'olunga's Samoan origins, and it's a narrative that's often repeated today.
I always disagree with people when they say we stole it from Samoa. No, we have our own.
Mirika Pusiaki Fifita is the founder of the Fe'unukola Global Academy that teaches Tongan performing arts. Hailing from the village of Lapaha, Milika comes from a famous line of punake, or master performing artists.
So Lapaha is the ancient capital of Tonga. And before the Christianity hit our shores, the Lapaha people were known as the choreographers, the composers to the Tuitonga. And when Christianity hit our shores, they banned some of the ancient dances.
She's conducted
And this is something that I think is really important, that we take into consideration. And we have driven this point heavily on the podcast, right? The academics jump to conclusions maybe a little too quickly. And it's hard for them to understand this because all they can do is reference other academics. And at the end of the day, when you go further and further back in the genealogy of academics, we inevitably end up with a Western perspective on Polynesian, and in this specific situation, on Tongan history, right? So, as this young lady here had expressed, number one, where she's from is very important. She's from Lapaha, right? It is the oldest and longest settlement of the Tuitonga, right? At the Tuitonga's height was during its settlements in Lapaha, not in anywhere else. And that's why it flourished for so long in that specific area. The other thing she mentioned is, again, this video is it is perpetuate. All it takes is one academic, one somewhat respected academic to make a statement. What will every other master's degree, PhD degree student going to do, right? Because you're always told to reference your work. Who you reference, who's the expert. Once you have that first prominent, academic make that statement, then all academics coming after will reference them, right? Because that validates their paper for their grade and their thesis that they'll have to defend. So this is where the academics have issues. When they run into someone here like Milika, who's from Lapaha, whose bloodlines probably go for hundreds to thousands of years with the Tuitonga, with a knowledge and a practice that they've been doing for hundreds to thousands of years, and knowledge that has been passed down through their blood for hundreds to thousands of years. And what does she say? I apologize, academics. I'm not trying to be rude. I'm not trying to cause problems. I'm not trying to be hateful. All those things that we get called here on the Polynesianized podcast, she just says, that is not what we know. And if you came and asked us, we would have said, not really. Right? This was a imported dance. And the reason why that's important is, as we discussed earlier, the languages were interconnected, the religion was interconnected, and it would naturally, the arts would have been connected. So, as Maui Tekelangi has shared here, the arts were not given up. This is what happens when you have a sophisticated level of understanding, a sophisticated level of navigating politics, a sophisticated level of how to play the game. And it is a game in many ways. It's a pretty dang serious game, but it's a game. And what is that game? Oh, our traditional dances are heathen, are savage, they're overly sensual, whatever, for whatever reason, right? Okay, we'll stop that. We'll stop that. But then they see, in Ha'amoa, even though there's a similar dance in Tonga, and she's gonna get into it, we're gonna adopt that. Samoa is already a Christian. We're gonna pull that over and we're going to implement that. We're going to use that as a more acceptable way. And we will adopt certain approaches that'll make it more acceptable. So it has on the outside, this is how effective this tool was, right? The intent was, we have the way Tongans have performed this dance for thousands of years. We need to find an avenue to restore it while not over shaking the apple cart. Or, this is the difference between coming with a hammer and coming with a precision surgeon knife, a surgical approach. The hammer is, no, forget it. We're going to just do what we want. We're going to do our dance. We've done it for thousands of years, blah, blah, blah. Forget you guys, right? Next minute, colonized. Next minute, your whole country's in disarray. Next minute, there's endless wars, internal wars. And you can find those examples throughout Polynesia. Or a more sophisticated way is, we have this dance. The one in Ha'amoa seems to be already gone through an initial acceptance for the most part. And if we have the perception that we're importing something and we're adapting it to more accept, and it gives us the opportunity to say, it gives you the defensive position that if you're attacked, to say you're holding on to your heathen rituals or culture, that one can say, no, but this is from Ha'amoa. We've imported this. You see how that disarms the attack? No, that's because the Westerner doesn't know we were all one nation, right? That we were all one nation and the dances were similar. But that's the level of sophistication when you've been the capital of the empire for thousands of years. You understand this level of politics and you implement it to leverage it to achieve the purposes that you have in mind. And how did this level of politics develop? Thousands of years of managing potential, disorder, potential war, managing changes in the empire. When you've been around for thousands of years, it is inevitable that you have changed, that you needed to adapt. This is the same concept that led to the Tu'itonga and the Tu'ihatakalaua being installed. After a couple assassinations, you have to figure out a way. Okay, there's a need for some level of restructuring. Okay, Tu'itonga says, I'm going to create the Tu'ihatakalaua. I'm going to give the Tu'ihatakalaua the administrative, the political, the governmental responsibilities. Tu'itonga is going to be elevated to a more spiritual, or isolated to a more spiritual, still above the Tu'ihatakalaua, right? And that restructuring brought stability for hundreds and hundreds of years. This is the same thing. And going back to what I mentioned earlier, this was so effective that the West went hook, line, and sinker 100%. They said, oh yeah, the Taolunga is 100% imported. That's not even a Tongan thing anymore. And then now people who don't understand our history, our own people, they say, oh, look, you guys were so lost or whatever, like you guys needed to import or borrow this or steal it. Borrow is probably a better word, but it was more like using that as leverage to retain the most fundamental pieces of the Tongan culture as it navigated Christianity, as it navigated new government, right? And that's what happens when you don't understand the history. And if it wasn't for this young lady to come here and share this, no one would have known, right? And these are the things we're talking about. All oral histories are not created equal, right? The oral histories that you've heard everywhere else that said that Taolunga was 100% import, well, that's not the oral history from La Paja, and La Paja was the center of the empire for thousands of years. Not all oral histories are created equal. That's not saying that all oral history is disregarded. We're just saying you got to be wise and you got to be mindful of it. Before we continue, we always take time to recognize our paid members and subscribers, paying subscribers to the channel. Mel Venu, appreciate it. Malo Mel, thank you for joining in. And as you can see, she has the symbol next to her name as a paying and supporting subscriber to a member of the channel. So thank you very much.
Extensive research into Tongan dance forms. Milika says the Tau Olunga has a more complex origin than merely copying Samoa. Milika says before Tau Olunga, there was the Ula, a dance performed by the
You see how that sounds very much like hula? Ula? It's the same stuff. It's the same stuff.
daughter of the highest village chief. She says that when Christian missionaries first arrived in Tonga, they deemed the Ola dance too suggestive.
Because the way that the hula girl moved, because the hula was like a very seductive dance, the missionaries thought
You notice just like the Hawaiian and the Tahitians, especially the hip movements and so forth, right? We shared a lot of similarities. You know, I want our brothers, especially our brothers and sisters in Eastern Polynesia who say, oh, we're so different. We're so unique. It's like, well, maybe the French liked what you guys were doing over there. And they said, keep doing it. Well, we were going through a little bit of a different situation. Before we continue here, we have another question. Nonsky says, tell me why Samoa have a knack to cover important history, especially Tonga. Why? The more you look into it more, the more put off I am when you find history that's been ruffled with. My only thoughts on that, Nonsky, is that's one of, I always tell in my work with my team, and I work in construction, there is never a solution. There's only trade-offs, right? There's never a silver bullet that if you make this one choice, you get everything you want. It is the nature of this existence. There are always trade-offs. And what you have to do when you make a choice is you look at the various options in front of you, and you look at each. If I go this way, this is what I gain, this is what I lose. If I go that way, this is what I gain, this is what I lose. If I don't do anything, this is what I gain, this is what I lose. Every decision has a trade-off. There are negatives of being an independent nation, right? And what is that negative? You are more isolated, which is the whole point of being sovereign, right? When you're sovereign, you have more control and you're more isolated, meaning it's less opportunities for things to come in and come out because you kind of control that a little bit more, let alone ancient history with families that have retained this for thousands of years. That's one of the negatives of being a wholly independent, never colonized civilization, right? That's the negative. And what's another negative? You don't get the same resources that a colonized nation would get. What do I mean by that? Typically, when you're colonized, you get more funds and more resources from who colonized you, whether it's infrastructure, whether it's trade, whether it's who gets to say what history is, right? Is, oh, we colonized this place, we have more access, we'll take whatever version of the history we like from this, and it gets pushed out into the academic world much faster and more accepted than a country that has maintained its independence, right? Because it's not as easy. There's less motivation to go into a independent country that doesn't necessarily have a lot of resources. There's not high prestige in pulling out oral history and real history from Tonga because it's independent and it's something that's somewhat isolated from academia. And so what's happening now, because of the digital world that we're living in and because of the free flow of information, the tide is turning. And once again, The negative was upfront. We couldn't tell our story early, but the positive is because we maintained our independence, once we get the resources, once we get the access, once we get the exposure, the tide will turn. And I think that's where we are now. We are at a situation now where Tonga can now tell its story, right? We don't have to just wait for the academics to come and tell our story. We don't have to wait for a television station to come and tell our story. We can jump online. We can have it through the podcast, right? The international public square where ideas can be discussed. And we're bringing it to the table and it's slowly making itself known to the world because it's almost inevitable, right, Nonsky? I mean, the more we dig into this stuff, it's kind of like you're saying, where the heck has all this been? And the reality is, it's been there. It's just hasn't been the right time, the right resources with the right people to get it out. And it's slowly making that, like this young lady here, where now we're starting to see it come up in the media. We're now starting to see these ideas flowing everywhere. Where before it was just in the academic circles, and there's a video I probably will run through, and I was pleasantly surprised. And this was a video with Devita Kairi, and he actually, from everything I've seen, he's always pushed a, kind of more the academic, Ha'amoa being the cradle of Polynesia and all these blah blah blah. But I've seen this video, and it was a couple years ago. He's making an interesting case that the migrations between Tonga and Hawaii were actually quite frequent. And there is evidence of back and forth and even, different migrations that happen. So maybe, hopefully we'll get to it because I want to spend the first hour or so on this portion. Then we're going to go revisit one of the studies we've looked at in the past. But that's something that's kind of interesting that we need to really push this and keep that conversation going, right? So appreciate that.
It's against their teaching and their beliefs.
The ban was serious enough that missionaries imposed fines on people who performed these dances. But Milika says that while Tongans
But I do want to just make a slight correction. Yes, it's true. It's originated from the missionaries, but Tonga was an independent, self-governed nation. And the leaders, in order to help facilitate the transition into the modern world, you have to negotiate these things, right? Like I said, everything has a trade-off. And our ancestors said, hey, look, do we personally think that dancing is evil and unacceptable? No, but we have to use this, right? We got to use this. We got to come with the surgical knife and be precise. We can carve out this, or in this case, let's give the impression that it's been carved out by saying, stop it. We're not going to do this ula dance, blah, blah, blah. Oh, by the way, we're going to bring it from Ha'amoa. And that will give us the political leverage to implement a dance that is more palatable, right? That is more acceptable, so that there's a bigger goal here. There's a bigger picture. And if we got to be willing to give and take, these are one of the areas we can give, right? And we can continue our efforts to keep our independence. Then there are areas that we will not negotiate. And what are the areas we will not negotiate? Land. We will not negotiate on the land. The land is for Tongans, by Tongans, and it will always be Tongans. That is where you hold the line, right? And so that is the level of sophistication that our ancestors have that we really underappreciate. Once again, I know I beat this like a dead horse, but I feel like our ancestors are dying for this message to be made. we underappreciate what the Tu'itonga did, the last few Tu'itongas did to save our sovereignty, to save our civilization, and to give us an opportunity that now, in today, imagine this, a sacrifice that was made hundreds of years ago, several hundred years ago, for something that won't come to fruition until now, right? Because everybody was looking at the Tu'iha Takalawa, oh, political power, administrative power. If the Tu'itonga became very selfish, if the Tu'itonga became very egotistical, if the Tu'itonga only cared about having quote unquote slaves, Tonga would not be independent. Tonga wouldn't have been able to survive because you need unity, you need structure, you need people to number one be unified, to buy into a vision, but to have the endurance and that mamahi'imea to push through even when it hurts, right? Even when the palangis are coming and say, we're going to fine you. And the government is saying, yep, we're going to honor that fine if you don't follow the instructions here. To endure that so that we can have this opportunity today, I think our people need to be very conscious and become very aware that the so-called Tu'itonga that the academics say was just a power hungry, a, you know, ultra fascist, ultra, dictator Tu'itonga, you have no idea what you're talking about. And you have no idea what type of sacrifice was made by the ancient Tongan leadership in order for Tonga to be here today, to be able to share what Polynesian civilization was made of, what it was built, what it was intended to achieve. That story can only start being told now, right? And academics have really turned the tide against that history because Tonga had to trade that off to stay independent. But the tide's turning. The tide is turning, and I believe it will almost be inevitable for all people to recognize, and that all Polynesians, once again, we say this quite a bit, but it's important. All Polynesians need to be proud that Tonga survived colonization because that is their civilization. The Polynesian civilization that survived through Tonga, that is something every Polynesian can be proud of because we are way more connected than people like to think and more than people understand. Starting to get a little too excited about these guys and girls. Once again, like, share, subscribe. If you want to contribute, a great way to contribute is to become a member of the channel. Go to the channel page, hit the join button. There are 2 levels to join there for a monthly contribution, or throw in a digital kava bag through the super chats, the super thanks, and the super stickers.
Embraced Christianity, they were reluctant to part with their dancing. To accommodate the ban, they reworked Thola, combining Christian and Tongan values to uphold the dignity of young
There
Tongan
we
women.
go.
Working with Milika's ancestors, Queen Salote further solidified the dance by restricting whole body movement.
Tau Olunga in Samoa is Tau Alunga, and it's beautiful, but they glide. They call it se'e. They move to the beat of the rhythm of the song. Whereas our Tau Olunga, we are standing still. We barely move around. It's mainly the upper part that we use for delivering our actions. So I think that's the difference you've seen from the ancient one and the current one.
All art absorbs and reflects the world around it. Pacific dance is no different.
Little girls, okay, everyone sitting down. We've always been navigating, we've always been traveling, and we've always been sharing dances, and all these different dances that we have been a way of us trading knowledge, trading culture with our neighboring Pacific Islands. Eyes up.
Milika's cousin Cecilia Pusiaki.
Before we continue there, I think they're using some very important words. We're always navigating. Like we're mentioning earlier, they're trying to navigate maintaining our culture with this new culture that's coming in, a new world, right? And you have to figure out a way to mesh those together. And I think that Taolunga, like they were mentioning, is a perfect expression of that effort, right? Where you're saying, okay, we want to hold on to the cores, the most core values of our civilization, but we also know we need to align it with Christianity because we've converted to Christianity. We see this as now being adopted into our new culture, right? This is no different than when the Tu'itonga creates the Tu'ihatakalaua and they say we need the Tu'ihatakalaua to thrive. What are we going to concede? Okay, the Tu'itonga is going to move to Ha'amoa and stay in Ha'amoa. Concede that. Why? They needed to move to allow the Tu'ihatakalaua to thrive. Because if the Tu'itonga stayed in Tonga, this new culture, this new administrative line that they're looking to build would not have thrived. It would have died and withered off. So they moved. Same thing here. Same thing here. Real quick before we go back. Hey, malo apito tevita toefoki. Malo, maukava. Throw your digital kava to the table. Tevita also says, that's Tuyalos Hako, one of the great punakes back in my father's days. Yes, those are, as you mentioned, those are families from that ancient capital. And yeah, this is why, once again, Tevita, and I think Tevita already knows this, but to everybody else, not trying to be overly exclusive, but where oral histories come from matter, right? The oral histories that are not from the proper lines and not from the proper places. I'm not saying that every oral history of that has to be accepted, but that, in my mind, that needs to be looked at a little bit more seriously than some other oral histories. Though you take them all, you have to navigate them. But when the oral histories come from the right lines, from the right people, from the right places, I think you got to take those a little more seriously and at least investigate them a little bit further than usual. Then, you can't take that at the same value as some random oral history from some random place. So once again, malo abito tevita, maukava, appreciate it and appreciate the support.
Is also a renowned teacher and performer of Tongan arts in Aotearoa. She says Tau'olunga continues to evolve even today because each village and each instructor brings their own experience to the table.
You will go back to Takamotonga. You will see the Ta'alunga of Takamotonga. You will go to Ha'apai, you will see their way of Ta'alunga. You will go to Wawa'u, Ahukehepe. It's not to say that one is better than the other or
Variety.
this is right or wrong,
Yeah.
but it's from the people that we learn from. If we have like a Punake in Tonga, they taught students. Those students now migrate overseas to Tonga, to America, to Australia, to New Zealand. Those students are now, lotolahi, they're courageous to venture out and start teaching.
But as Tau'olunga evolves, so too do other Tongan dance forms. Nowadays, there are many practitioners that experiment. Hollyfest, one of the biggest cultural high school competitions in the world, is just the place to find out. It's one of the most prominent stages for Tongan dance, and you won't just find Tau'olunga. You'll see Tongan dances like the Me'etupaki, the Tauwhanganua, and the Ma'olulu. It's also where you'll see schools experiment, blurring the lines between traditional and contemporary. In 2024, Manurewa High School's performance caused some controversy with their interpretation of the Queen Salote song Siueli Oi Pasifiki, or Jewel of the Pacific.
This composition was, I think, one of her memoirs where she shared about the different places in the Pacific that she visited: Samoa, Tahiti, Hawaii, and Fiji. And so we were a bit controversial in that we didn't follow the traditional format of the Ma'ululu. It was intentionally not.
Just something real quick I wanted to throw in there. Um, the Malulu, which is also credited of coming from Hamua, I believe it was called the Otuhaka, right? Otu meaning the rose, and everybody doing the haka, but they brought in the Malulu, restructured it, and said, "Oh yeah, look, this is not the quote unquote traditional Otuhaka. This has been modified and brought from externally, and we're now using that." But for all intents and purposes, just like the Ula became the Tauolunga and the Otuhaka became the Malulu, it's just repackaged, right? Like they say, you put lipstick on the pig, but it's still a pig. Repackaged it, made some changes to it to make it more palatable to the era and the times. And now we have it now, right? So very interesting.
Authentically Tongan. And we decided to add in these aspects of Hawaiian, Samoan, Tahitian, and Fijian culture in terms of their dance to go in line with the composition. When you decide to do something new, or when you decide to innovate in a space where you don't necessarily own this aspect of culture, because culture and our perspective anyway is something is communal, and every time that you decide that you want to innovate in such a communal space, you have to be prepared for someone within that community to say, oh, that's not how we do things.
Milika says platforms like Polyfest are the places to express creativity and experiment.
I think for Polyfest, it's more into the contemporary content of our culture. We must know that if the princess visits, or people of higher status in our society, then it's more appropriate to teach a traditional ones, because there are rules. You are not allowed to tap your you're not allowed to fakahila. Those are disrespectful because they are of high status.
5, 6, 5, 6, 7, and up.
I think that in order for any culture to survive, it needs to evolve with the times, but there needs to be very distinct guidelines as to what the changes are that you are going to make to the favor, and we need to ensure that we're always um, going back to deliberate with the elders. So we're always going back to the older generation.
Very interesting. Very, very interesting, right? The couple things I wanted to bring up here, her comments, and I'm seeing a couple comments here from Levi Vera. Let's just bring it up. People can see here real quick. Otuhaka was for people of rank. Maululu commoners do it. Everyone could. Tui here also says the same thing. Once again, maybe that's true. Maybe you guys are right. I don't know the exact details on that. But the point is, it was modified and it was changed. And if it was before, it was only for people of rank. Okay, well now it's for everyone. That could have been one of the modifications that were, that were done. The one item I wanted to kind of discuss a little bit further was, Milika's discussion on she's cool with, Pacifica Fest or whatever having their own modifications that's for entertainment value, right? And then coming in for when there's a royal visitor, that you do a more traditional one. And I agree with that 100%. And she kind of explains a couple reasons why. There are certain things that are not acceptable, right? Like moving your leg, doing a little side hila, where it's like in entertainment value only. In general settings, that's kind of like, hey, that's cool. but it's in more formal settings, that's kind of a little bit more frowned upon. But at the same time, change happens. And how does change get adopted into the more traditional sense? When people of authority and rank say or accept it, right? Like, for example, if the king of Tonga were to come out and say, this is how I want, I will accept this type of behavior in this type of dancing, and started to implement it, then that becomes the rule. The more important thing here is not necessarily that there is a rule. What's more important is how the rules are managed and maintained. That's the more important feature. And this is something that we all need to understand. This is how you navigate. They mentioned many times. How do we navigate this? Well, it's understanding the details. It's not the rule itself that is unnegotiable. It is how the rule is established or determined. If the rule comes from the right authority and through the right channels, then it can be recognized and it can be established, just like laws. Laws can change, laws can be reformed. And that is if the right authority through the right channels makes that change. And we're seeing, I don't know about you guys, but I'm seeing a lot of indirect hints and changes, especially from the royal family. They are working from what I've observed, to be much more accessible than they have been in the past, right? And that is, they've made themselves more accessible, more personable, more relatable to the average Tongan. And so that back in the day, that was kind of like a no-no. It was always about maintaining that hierarchical separation. And I'm not saying that they've closed it. What they've done is they've just leveled it a little bit more, just like they did with the Otuhaka, maybe, as some have shared, just like they've done with so many other things in giving land to commoners. It is somewhat bringing that gap into an acceptable range with each other. So that's one of the few things I wanted to bring up there and have a discussion on, is how interesting, right? How interesting is that? Something that the academics had thought was a unchallengeable position of, oh yeah, it came from Samoa, blah 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 blah. It was 100% Samoan and implemented. Then we find out later, oh, our ancestors were that good at navigating politics. They not only put that, pulled a fast one on the missionaries of their time, they pulled a fast one on academics, PhDs for hundreds of years. That's how good they were, right? And we got to give them some credit. A lot of times it feels like the modern day look back and with their, savage like behaviors and blah, blah, blah. And then we can't even figure out the schemes that they put out. And it's not until their descendants come out and say, well, actually, this is what was actually going on. So, anyways, I find that kind of hilarious and very educational, which is why I wanted to walk through that video. So, appreciate these sisters here for sharing that and bringing that to light for us to enjoy here on this live digital kava session. There are, once again, we're gonna shift here. We got like for this block of the show, I'm going to pull out, where did I save it? I'm going to pull out a couple videos here that I thought we had saved. I thought I had pulled it out, but I guess I did not. Oh, it was on TikTok. That's where it was. So I need to go to TikTok here real quick. Once again, appreciate all the support there. If you want to make a comment or share a just some digital kava here, please feel free to do so through the super chats, the super thanks, and also once again, one of the ways that we recognize our members of the channel, paid members of the channel, is we have them recognize them as they make comments throughout the show. So I'm gonna share this, and there before I do that, I'm gonna set the stage a little bit. There is this idea in Eastern Polynesia and a lot of academics that Eastern Polynesia was like its own thing. Western Polynesia, meaning Tonga and Samoa, the Lau, Tokelau, Niue, all that area. We really didn't do much over there. At best, there was just a migration of people over there, and that was it. And that's one idea. I've also seen this other idea that Eastern Polynesia says that they were the center of the Polynesian Empire. I think that's an interesting thing to say. I don't think it has a lot of backing for it, but hey, we're still working it out with our Samoan brothers and sisters on those minor details. Once we get that locked in and we're united after that, then we'll turn our attention a little bit more to Eastern Polynesia. But I'm going to share a video here by Tevita Kairi, which kind of surprised me a little bit. We've asked Mr. Kairi to join us. He said he would at some point. Hopefully he does. We'd love to have him join and have a discussion on the podcast. But he shared something, and I guess this was a year or two ago, somewhat of a surprise, because he shares certain connections that one would almost say, well, why in the world wouldn't you believe we were all one civilization, and why wouldn't you believe Tonga was the center of the Polynesian Empire? But let's walk through this and listen through this, and we'll finish off this section of the show with this, and then we'll go to that study that we were looking at. I see everyone recognized where Barbecue Joe. Ay, yawe, Mari e mua, Papa Q. Ay, yawe. Uh-oh. Looks like we're not hearing the audio. My bad. Thank you for the heads up. I got a text. Thank you, Nina. Malo, we're gonna redo that. We're gonna fire the intern, guys. What do you guys think? Don't get fire, intern. Talangan tu ofiha ke aye sound ka fi halaki pe. Don't get that, ye intern.
Now, I want to begin by sort of maybe talking a little bit about, thinking about what are the, ways that Tonga and Hawaii have been intersecting for thousands of years. And so I will talk about the first wave and the second wave. I have about 4 different waves of connections between Tonga and Hawaii. But I'm going to first begin with the first wave. As you can see here, this is sort of kind of where the science mainly believed that how people came to migrate.
This really surprised me coming from this gentleman because typically, unless I'm mistaken, but I put him in the category of he's the supporter of Ha'amoa being the center of Polynesia, right? The cradle. That's where the capital was. So it's kind of interesting. I went and looked at this full videos on YouTube. This was about 3 years ago. So interesting for me to kind of hear him have this discussion because I'm all for this, right? I'm a big believer in this. I'm a big believer we were going back and forth. Now, I might get a little bit into the details. I don't think every island was going back and forth. I think maybe the high chiefs and the high rank families around the islands, maybe they were doing some navigation. But I will say this, there is very strong evidence Tonga had the most frequent migrations or navigators to other islands. And that seems to be like, once again, and it makes sense. That was the capital. That's where the resources were. That's where all the knowledge, concentrated from thousands of years. And that's why and before I continue, I just want to reinforce every Polynesian nation, right, should be proud that Tonga survived colonization because there were ideas from every part of the Polynesian Empire all went to Tonga. And the collective experience of all of Polynesia concentrated in Tonga. Right? And that's why every Polynesian should be proud of that. And that's why we should be united in that belief and in that context.
Into Moana Nui Akea, kind of first to the Tonga, Samoa, Fiji area, and then from there out to Tahiti, and then Marquesas and some of those areas, and then up to Hawaii. And then there was sort of kind of a return migration that came back down, and it went down to Aotearoa. So the first wave is kind of the coming down and going up to Hawaii, and then also the return migration that came down. And we're talking about 1000 AD, around that particular time when Hawaii was kind of settled, and then people were still going back and forth. Lots of movement that were happening within Moana Nui Akea. So deep sea voyages between Tonga and Hawaii were happening at these, and we have them recorded in our Talai Whanua or our Molelo. And they go from,
and I second that, and Tongans were the only ones that I'm aware of that even when the Western civilization was embarking and starting to make contact with Polynesia, Tongans were the ones that were still migrating as a people to Ha'amoa, to Tokelau, to Fiji, and so much more, and that was when they were going into decline, into civil war that would last multiple generations, right? And so can we only imagine in its prime how much more common that was? And as far as I know, Tongans are the only ones in documented history that were doing international, by today's standards, international deep sea voyages. Right? And so How do you not see that? So, and I agree with Dr. Kaidi here, but like I said, I was pretty surprised to come across this because, like I mentioned, he's much more from my perspective, and I could have been wrong. He's in the Ha'amoa as the cradle, so it's interesting.
All the different places, including Tahiti, or what we call Tahisi in Tongan, and other places where we move because of our double-hulled canoe that we had. Not only the technology, but also the astronomy and the navigation skill to do some of these things. And I'll talk a little bit about them also later. Now, I want to begin by talking about three main ancestors that connects both Tonga and Hawaii. And I refer to them as trans-indigenous ancestors because they move across the two places, across the indigenous area of both Tonga and Hawaii. One coming from our Talatupua, our creation story, our cosmogony, and then one coming out of the Kumulipo. When you get to about the 15 wa of the Kumulipo, the 15 period, there are ancestors that are identified there, such as Tangaloa in Tonga and Kanaloa in Hawaii, Maui in Tonga, Maui in Hawaii, and Hina and in Tonga and Hina in Hawaii. The thing is about them is that their genealogy is similar, and that such as Akalana is sort of kind of the father, and then Maui came after that. Same in Tonga, we have Maui Akalanga, who is Maui Akalana in Hawaiian, and Maui Kisikisi in Tonga was Maui Kiki in Hawaiian. And so, these are, I would say, would be the first wave of migration.
And for the most part, I agree with that. We use a different term. And Water Bears ask here, Tahiti. Yes, that's the ancient name for Tahiti for Tongans, is that. We use a different term for Tangaloa and Maui, and they have Hina here, but we say Loau or Ha'amea, right? Or the Taula. We say those are the three founding fathers of the Polynesian civilization. So I would agree, yes, the first wave. Was it the first Tangaloa and the first Maui and the first Ha'amea or Taula who made it up to Hawaii? Not sure if it was that quick of a migration. But we also know that Tangaloa, and Maui, those were titles that you inherited. And when you inherited that title, you took on the name of the title, right? If your name was Sione, right? I know that's a Western name, but we're just going to use the example. If your name was Sione, but once you became Tangaloa, you were no longer referred to as Sione. You were referred to as Tangaloa. Now, it seems like some Tangaloas and Mauis were given names, and a lot of it was tied to certain feats or certain accomplishments. Sometimes this happened with the Tuitonga when you add the Fekai, right? Kaulfonua, and then they add the Fekai because of certain actions he took. That seems to be the driver behind the additional descriptions. So, yeah.
Or movement between Tonga and Hawaii. And there's so many similarities between this that you can see as I go through my presentation. I'll show that. We also have a Tangaloa Atulongalonga, who I think is Lono here in Hawaii. And we have several Tangaloa. The one that is specifically involved with the ocean is Tangaloa Mana, which is the one that's most likely connected to the one here in Hawaii. So to me, these are the connections, the early connection, and these were sort of kind of going back thousands of years to the movement between the places. Now, I see them as deified ancestors, meaning that they were real ancestors, but because of their great achievement in art and science, they were elevated to the level of.
And I will say that one of the very first people to ever come up with that idea was Te Vita Fale. right? Maybe there were some others out there, but the ones obviously that I first came across that ever said that Maui and Tangaloa were not gods, they were not demigods, they were men, they were the founding fathers of the Polynesian Empire, was Te Vita Fale. So interesting to hear this from Te Vita Kaili, that he has that perspective, and wonder if that could be influenced from Te Vita Fale's work.
Otua or Akua in Hawaiian, deified ancestors, and that's the reason why many of their deep history, their story continues to be part of who we are today. And I want to show just some example of how these ancestors, even though they were thousands of years ago, they continue to be part of the conversation as up to right now. People continue to talk about these ancestors, and Tongans here in Hawaii find themselves connecting to these stories, especially when it's a conversation about Kanaloa or Tangaloa in Tongan, or Maui and Maui and Hina. Now, I want to begin by.
So yeah, that's the first part. I have one other video that I wanted to kind of walk through as well, but I was pleasantly surprised by this, right? Like pleasantly surprised by this. So thought that was interesting. Appreciate that, and maybe the corner's turning, guys and gals. Maybe we're turning the corner here. Maybe people are starting to realize, yeah, we were all one people, right? They had the hula in Hawaii, we had the ula in Tonga, we had Tangaloa in Tonga, we had Kanaloa up there, right? They had Maui, we had Maui, but we had Maui and Tangaloa living on Tongatapu, right? But the point is, we're sharing this history, this commonality, and that we were one people, right? And there's reasoning behind that. And I'm waiting for Mr. Aotearoa. There's an episode I've put together that I'm just dying to get out. I've had it for like a month, but I'm waiting for Mr. Aotearoa to get back to Manurewa and stop having so much fun, stop traveling and having a good time, because it is a compilation of first contacts with Ha'amoa. And it is very evident that Tonga were the navigators of the sea. And you know how we made the comment one time that, Ha'amoa got the name Navigators Island because they saw all these karias and stuff parked out there. We casually said, like, hey, it'd be funny is if those were just all the Tongans over there, Tui Tonga over there. And there's some things in there that seem to indicate that, right? And where the word Papa'alangi comes from and how it originates from Tonga. There's some of those interesting things in there. Talks about tattooing. So I can't wait to get this episode out to build on this idea, right? And really solidify, because we got to get our Samoan brothers and sisters on board. We really got to put that information out. And then the next thing we're going to turn to is Eastern Polynesia, right? This head of the octopus in Tapu Tapu Atea and how they were so different from us and all these things. We got to bring them back into as well, right? So I can't wait for that episode. I'm excited for it, but gotta get Mr. Aotearoa back to Manurewa so we can get that show online for you guys.
One of the things, this is just kind of to talk about Maui. Many of us are very familiar with Maui just because of the stories of Maui are often evoked and talked about. So in Tonga, Maui Atalanga is the father of Maui Kiskisi, just like how Akalana here in Hawaii, as shown in the Kumulipo, is father to the Mauis. We have stories about Maui fishing up islands, similar to the stories here, Maui fishing up island in Hawaii. We have stories of Maui raising the sky, similar to what's here in Hawaii with Maui. Sharing fire making, or making fire and sharing it with people. Similar stories in Tonga and also here in Hawaii. Snaring the sun, Haleakala there in Maui is known for that story, but Tongans also have a story about Maui's snaring the sun. And we also use a lot of stones to commemorate Maui in our area. So for us, we see Maui as this ancestor that was moving back and forth between Tonga and Hawaii, and of course other islands within Moana Nui Akea.
Very interesting.
But the similarity.
I don't know. I mean, he did this video 3 years ago, right? Very interesting. 3 years ago. So in terms of Polynesian history, very recent. But in some of our discussions, I was like, he should just get on board the Tuitonga train, the Polynesian Empire train. He should just come join us on the podcast and have a conversation. We have a lot to discuss on common ground. We don't have to get into the stuff that we don't agree on, just kind of like we had Sunny. We also had Manasseh Lua, I think. He has his own perspectives of Ha'amoa possibly being the origin, and that's fine. We don't have a problem with that. We don't want to force down anything on anyone, So I don't know. This was kind of interesting.
Similarities in our stories, that we have so many points of similarity, shows us that this was the same Maui that was going back and forth, and then we also mark it with different stones that we use. My friend Glenview Ngaluafe drew this story just to kind of show you Maui and its involvement with us. There are some other things that Maui are important to us, such as breadfruit and crops. Some of our stories talk about Maui when after he fished up the island, he came out, and of course plants came out of his underneath his feet. Now we see this as metaphoric stories for navigation and discovering new islands, and
I find it interesting. Well, at least it's in the middle, right? But the Ha'amonga of Maui is a big deal, right? One would think at least it's in the center, but I would hope it would be larger and more prominent. There's a reason why the Ha'amonga is only on Tongatapu, right? And so that's something that I think is if I were to add a little criticism, not that I'm criticizing, but a 2 cents, but pretty decent art. But yeah, I would highly emphasize that the Ha'amonga was critical.
Discovering new islands using Maui's fishhook, which is Mata'ua Maui, or Maui's fishhook with the Scorpio constellation, and using that to navigate to different places. But when they're told in these poetic form, they're beautiful and able to pass down those stories from generations to generation. But what is also fascinating is the places where Maui arrived, both in Tonga and in Hawaii. Many of them are commemorated with stones or boulders, but also mountains that are named after them. So I'm going to show you a few of these sort of kind of deep connections. This one on the one on Tonga, the one in Kala'au, you can see, look at the size of the vehicle in comparison to this to this Maui rock that we have. And this, and I've been to different places like Nanakuli, where they also have Maui stones. And of course, there's mountains in Hawaii that are also associated with the Maui and the work that they do. But similar kinds of work have been done in both places to mark the migration and the movements of Maui, this ancestors between the two places. We have additional boulders all over in Tonga that commemorates Maui for us. These are in Haveluliku. It's one of our town in Tongatapu, in the eastern part of Tongatapu. You can see here that we have several of them. You can see in here, similar to the way that Hawaiians have a lot of different boulders or stones to commemorate also Maui's feat or Maui's deeds that he's done in both places. So the idea of using this is common to both places here. Now, I want to spend some time talking about the intersecting of Hina in Tonga and Hina in Hawaii. Both are, use the same form, spell the same. So one of the things is just kind of to talk about Maui. Many of us are very familiar with Maui just because of the
Looks
story.
we're going back there, but I thought that was interesting to close out this segment. Right, was to kind of bring that up that there's more than sufficient evidence to make the case that we were one nation from top to bottom, the entire Polynesian empire, Polynesian nation. And the idea of our Eastern Polynesian brothers and sisters that, that they were separate, they were their own thing and so forth. Maybe, maybe not. But there is more than sufficient evidence that we were the same people. And that's somewhere we'll kind of turn our attention to, hopefully, as we start turning the corner with our Ha'amoa brothers and sisters and get unified with them. Because at the end of the day, those are the two older siblings, right? Tonga and Ha'amoa. Tonga and Ha'amoa, we are the older siblings. Many of us share blood. There are many Tongans that have Samoan blood, many Samoans that are Tongan blood. And it's all the same group, same people, same family. We've just been separated for a very long time. Mel, we are connected 100%. Thank you, B, for being a paid member of the channel. Greatly appreciate it. And that's why we love you. And you get the preferred treatment here whenever you join us on a live. And building off of that, once again, real cool way for you to contribute and also make sure that your comments, questions are pushed to the top of the queue. There are a lot of comments going on YouTube. We can't get to every single one because if we did, we'd never get to the content of the show. But we do go out of our way to make sure we highlight our paying members of the channel. So greatly appreciate that. Thank you, Mel. 100%. So with that being said, we're going to navigate out of this segment and we're going to close out the show. And I think this is hilarious because, this is something we've already discussed and visited many times with people here on the show, but we're going to keep revisiting it and we're going to keep discussing it until, we get a lot of this. Oh, you guys are just ideas. You guys are just, what they like to say is receipts. You guys don't have receipts. And we're like, dude, do you know how many studies we've gone through and we'll go through the same studies again? If you need it, right? We're going to do that again. We're going to keep doing it until we get you guys to actually just accept the reality, right? That these are documented ideas and these are ideas. Oh, that's too zoomed in. We're going to zoom out a little bit. Okay, looks like Nonsky has a question here. We'll discuss before we make the switch. Let's see. Since we're on the topic of Kalietokowas, the great Waka Takitumu that came to New Zealand had multiple names. Taraipo named Va Tonga, great chief in Ha'amoa, as the story goes, grandson of Toi. Really interesting. And I'm wondering if we're saying Taraipo was the first name given. Interesting. I'm not too familiar with that, Nonsky, but I appreciate you sharing that additional information. Okay. All right. So for all of those who looks like Mel has something to add in there, she adds Toi Te Huatahi. Is that one of the name of the boats that you're sharing there, Mel? But I'll let the conversation. Yes, I know Masi had said that Toi was the one, I believe, who brought the Moa back to Tonga. Okay, That's it. So toi huatahi, as Mel was mentioning earlier. So okay, yes, I do remember Mr. Atearoa bringing that up. That Toi was recognized as bringing the moa at one point back to Tonga, and that there's an area named after that. So we're going to get into this. We're going to start off by saying this is a journal from Cambridge, right? A scientific journal. I don't know how you get more receipts than this, right? For all those who get confused and tell us, hey, oh, you guys are just bringing up ideas here. This is your chance. Look at the links here. Look at the volume. Look at the issue number. Look at the date. Look at the pages, right? And you can even write this link down if you want to look at the link right here and download it. And it's by Jeffrey Clark, Christian Rippemeyer, and Nivaleti Merekiola. Okay. And they tell you how to cite their work. Okay. That's some receipts for those who are always looking for receipts. So it's titled The Rapid Emergence of the Archaic Tongan State, the Royal Tomb of Paepaetelea. So why are we going through this study again? This study, after we've had this whole discussion about dance, we've had all this discussion about how we're one nation. This is a study that recognizes that Tonga was the center of a archaic state, right? When you say state, it's organized, it's structured, it's scalable, right? And that's something that is extremely rare to be found, whether it's in oral history or in recorded history in Polynesia. Yet Tonga has both the oral and recorded history that discusses this. And we're not going to read the whole paper, right? Unlucky for me, I had the privilege of going through the paper and highlighting the portions that matter most for our discussion. To save you guys, this is where your $5 a month, your $10 a month goes to as a paid member to motivate me to continue to adding some of this work. So we're going to read this little highlighted section here, right? So it shows where the Paepaetelea is. It's in Mu'a, specifically La Paha, in the main island of Tonga Tapu in the Kingdom of Tonga. And it says, new research indicates that the royal tomb Paepaetelea was built AD 1300 to 1400, more than 200 years earlier than its traditional association with Urakimata I, who ruled when the Tongan polity was at its greatest extent. Now, here's the things that's interesting, right? Every time they dig into Tongan archaeology, the Tongan dates do not get younger and younger, they get older and older. That's something that's really important. Why is that important? When they look at the archaeology of the Pulemele and they do the carbon dating there, when they look at, the Ta'u Island and the Tu'imanua, they don't get older, they get younger. And that's just a pattern. That's just a pattern I'm saying. So here, they're identifying that the Paepaetelea was built much, much earlier than anticipated, right? And because a lot of people, by the time you say 1300, 1400 AD, they're thinking about Momo and Tu'itatui in that time frame. But now we're seeing that the Paepaetelea was at 1300 and 1400. So Urakimata was after Momo and Tu'itatui, which means Tu'itatui and Momo are much earlier. I mean, much later in history, right? Much earlier. They came before the 13 and 1400s, possibly 11 to 1000s, which throws the whole Aho Etu in 900 AD, right? And Te Vitafale says he's gone and taken the Tuitongas and tied them to specific settlements, and he's at 450 AD, but even he concedes there could be many more, and it could go back much further. But David Tafale's list is the best list we have in our perspective because he has tied the names to specific settlements, right? We've seen that the strongest positions are when you have oral history that's tied to archaeological ruins or information. That's the strongest that you can get in our perspective. So he says the large and stylistically complex tomb marks a dramatic increase in the scale of mortuary structures. It represents a substantial mobilization of labor by this early archaic state, while the geochemical signatures of stone tools associated with the tomb indicate long distance voyaging. What they're talking about is they found the tools around the area of the Paipatera are from throughout the Polynesian Empire, which would make sense if Tongatapu was the capital, right? They did a similar study in Ha'amoa. 99% was from Ha'amoa. Doesn't sound like when you're the capital, right? Like when you're the capital, you have the best of everything from throughout your empire brought into one location. So interesting. All right. The evidence suggests that the early Tongan state was a powerful and geographically expansive entity, able to rapidly organize and command the resources of the scattered archipelago. Once again, people underestimate how difficult it is to manage an empire, how difficult it is to keep a unified country, a cohesive culture of history and resources to maintain it, right? That's why all these people, politicians, are like, oh, I have the greatest idea in the world, and if you just let me lead, I'm going to go in and I'm going to change your world. And then they go in and they can't do anything because it's not as easy as it sounds. It's not as easy as it sounds. And we covered this. Power is powerful, but it's also very fragile. Maintaining power, maintaining cohesiveness, maintaining stability, maintaining unity. That is a very difficult thing to achieve. Even in the modern world, there are areas in the world who, for thousands of years, have never been able to achieve cohesiveness. And one of the areas we need to be very proud of is in Polynesia. Despite the scattered resources and the fact that we were spread throughout millions of square miles of ocean, we were able to do that. And we did so for thousands of years. That's not a small feat. That's something that we should all be proud of as Polynesians. All right, it says here, the remains of archaic states hold the clearest evidence available of the decisive social and political processes that accompanied the creation of complex societies. State-level societies are rare in the prehistoric Pacific. For all those who want receipts, here's your receipts. I'm not going to go and hand deliver it to you with a foot massage. Okay? Here, this is where they're referring, this comes from. Right? Very rare to have prehistoric state societies. The archaic Tongan state is the only, I repeat, the only known polity in Oceania to extend political control over an entire archipelago and to influence islands beyond its borders. What kind of receipts are these people looking for? Right? If you don't understand the fragile nature and the difficulty of maintaining a political state, then you'll just easily believe any oral history that you hear out there. Right? Then all of a sudden, your oral history gets excavated. Your oral history leads to excavation and archaeological work on the archaeology on your island, and we find Ufi pits rather than royal tombs. So once again, can't overstate it. The only verifiable state that expanded political power outside of its borders, Tonga. Right? And I know in here they're talking about Tonga as in Ha'apai Vava'u, but we need to remember, we need to look at the islands. The right way to look at the islands in the Pacific are like villages on an island. Tongatapu was the capital, it was the center. Ha'apai and Vava'u were island groups that were outside. Of course, they were the nearest, but they, in all intents and purposes, were their own groups of people, right? And as we saw in the dance, even within those groups, they developed their own stylistic preferences on culture, on dance, on politics. Even when it showed once the Tongan state was starting to fracture, all of a sudden we have Atu'i Ha'apai and Atu'i Vava'u, right? Self-declared Tu'i. So once again, we can't overemphasize how important it is to recognize Tonga is the only one. The oral history, and when we push back at other people who say, oh, but the Tui Manua Empire and the Tui Pulotu Empire. Well, where's the evidence, man? Let's what was going on? It's like, oh, they were just so old, they don't have any data. All right, man. But then every time we dig into the data, it's only as old as the Tu'itonga, and the Tu'itonga was in power at that time. I find that interesting. Right? Here's another one. A lot of people started to tell us that, the Fonuatanu, which is all this gray area over here, I just kind of guessed it would be about 100 acres. They said, oh, the only person who's ever talked about the Fonuatanu is Tevita Fara, and he's just made it up. There's no scientific evidence for the Fonuatanu, right? And just so everybody understands how rare of this is, I'm not aware of any other location in Polynesia. Approximately 100 acres of man-made land. All of this gray area right here, man-made land. Right? Here are all the langis of the Tu'itonga, right? Here's the Pai Telea, J20, and I can't remember. Namoala, I think is the name of this langi. That's right there. But where did all this land have to come from? And just looking at the land will tell you the story. For all the people who say, oh, the Tu'i Hatakalaua took over the Tu'itonga. No, just look at what the Tu'i Hatakalaua had to do. Though the Tu'itonga relocates to Ha'amoa, the Tu'i Hatakalaua doesn't come and build anything. This is the old shoreline, right? The Tu'i Hatakalaua doesn't build anything on the Tu'itonga's land. Why? If he, quote unquote, usurped power from the Tu'itonga. Why did he go through the trouble of creating new land? Kauhala Lalo, right? Why? Because the Tu'itonga was still in charge. The Tu'itonga was still the head of state. The Tu'i Hatakalaua created his inheritance. And that's where these are all the ditches, right? These are the ditches that they dug to get to the bedrock to use as a foundation, and then soil to go on top. This is civil engineering, complex civil engineering. There are people still building their houses and still live on this land, potentially thousands of years after it was built. I don't know of any other example anywhere in Polynesia that has that. And yet people try to mock us and say, geez, you guys hold on to your ruins. Like ruins aren't even that big of a deal. Well, that's kind of a big deal when I look at it. That would be like smirking at Egypt and saying, yeah, that's not a big deal. Whatever, pyramids. Well, I don't know. We got earth pyramids galore over here. We have large ones built on reclaimed land from the ocean, from the lagoon. I don't know. I'm just saying. People want receipts. I don't know what more. If this is not a receipt, I don't know what a receipt is. Right? Now tell me what kind of sophisticated society you can do this with. Do you understand the level of resources that you need to organize, the amount of labor, right? There's oral history that for the Pai Telea, a lot of that labor force was brought from Haamoa, right? And that right next to it is a little property called Lakufue because that's where the workers from Haamoa would come and put their fue, right? Before they go to work. The history is in the land, in the names. It's undeniable. Here's some more receipts, right? We're going for the people who want receipts. Tongan state emerged in eastern Tongatapu at Heketa in the 12th to 13th centuries AD, and after the capital relocated to La Paja, the state reached its height around AD 1500 following an aggressive campaign of inter-island warfare conducted by 24th holder of the title paramount to Itonga, Lord of Tonga. This one, I know they say inter-island warfare. I don't know how much of that is true, though it is possible, right? And by this time, like we're mentioning here, the Tu'ihatakalawa was the administrative, political, military power. If the state was being expanded by military force, the Tu'ihatakalawa would have been the one physically educating or executing that plan and being directed by the Tu'itonga, because the Tu'itonga is, for the most part, living in Ha'amoa for a good little bit. But also, it's very difficult to establish long-term peace and stability when you conquer through that. I'm not saying that military force was not an option, but the Tu'itonga seems to be a pro at soft power and negotiating and establishing peace without war. And I say that because that's where intermarrying becomes very important. That's where politics, there you can exercise physical force or you can exercise politics, right? And allocating of resources and managing of people and locations to achieve and establish, right, a structured society that one could govern and oversee. Here's another interesting statement here. It says the tomb is the largest prehistoric structure made in worked stone in the South Pacific and contains blocks of coral limestone weighing up to 20 tons. Now, this is the key difference. And we talked about this with Mr. Aotearoa. You look at all the major monuments throughout Polynesia, it's stacked rocks, meaning rocks in their natural state haven't been lined, haven't been edited, and they're just stacked. The Pulemele, right? We look at the forts in Uvea and Futuna. We look at the Tapu-Tapu-Atea and all the maraes in the different areas. They were stones taken in their natural shape and form and used to build structures. In Tonga is the only place that they're the largest where we know stone was carved specifically for that purpose. So that's why it says in worked stone, the ha'amonga, the different langis, all the stones there. So that's a really important piece, that the largest made in work stone structures are on Tongatapu. Okay, third, the presence of stone tools associated with the tomb and geochemically sourced to multiple islands indicates frequent long distance voyaging and the growth of tributary base. There is a clear correlation between monuments and centralization right here. And the Paepaeo Telea indicates that within 100 years, in the early Tongan state was able to organize and command the resources of a scattered archipelago. This is what we say, like ruins matter. Ruins represent something. They represent structure, they represent organization, they represent stability, they represent resources. Like ruins is not something you just kind of be like, that doesn't mean anything. Well, it doesn't mean anything because you may not have the ruins that mean anything to you, but large ruins speak volumes. Oral history alone has value, also has weaknesses. Oral history that has archaeological ruins, archaeological studies, and ruins to back it up, now you have something special. Now it's no longer just a story in the backyard, right? It's physically tied to reality. Okay. We'll just read just the highlighted portions here just for speed. In Tongan traditions, J20, that's the Paepaeo Telea, is associated with the 29th Tuitonga Urakimata, also known as Telea. So once again, names are given, the Tuitonga are given names, and Urakimata, we've mentioned this story before. There are two brothers, both are the first or oldest sons of two sisters from Haamoa. When Tapuosi returns the Tuitonga after its hiatus in Haamoa, not because they were chased out, but because they wanted the Tuihatakalaua to be established. When he brings the Tuitonga back, he says to his two sons, the first of you that I see, Urakimata bete usiukiai, koe Tuitonga. The first face I see will be called Tuitonga. So this Tuitonga gets the name Urakimata because he was the first one to show up. His name was Terea, who lived around 1600. The structure is famous for its massive limestone blocks that were reputedly made in Uvea Island and taken 850 kilometers to Tongatapu on giant voyaging canoes, canoe Lomi Peao. Like this, just think about what we're saying here. Stones that are 20 tons, right? Tens of thousands of pounds were cut hundreds of miles away, put on a karia. And not just any karia. The Lomi Peao is known as the largest karia that existed, right? And you get the name Lomi Peao because it pushes against the waves. That's how large it was. And you're loading and unloading these large stones and shipping them. Even by today's standard, that is a ton of work. A ton of work. The technology, the resources, the science behind all of that. That speaks volumes. Tell me oral histories that are tied to physical structures like that. Tell me where. Tell me where we have hundreds of acres of man-made land reclaimed from the ocean. Right? I don't know of many stories. If there are others out there, I'd like to hear it. And it's verified. We looked at the videos from Uvea, right? Where the gentleman was saying, yeah, this is where they cut a lot of the stones from. Seems like a prime location. Stone, exposed stone, right next to the ocean where you could cut it, right? Tie it to the bottom of the Lomi Peao and ship it hundreds of miles and do that over and over and over again. Not easy work to do, right? So how much stone did they get from Uvea? The total amount of quarried stone in J20 was initially estimated at 519 tons, but block dimensions recorded during tomb excavation in 2014 indicate that the structure probably contains 700 tons. So we're looking, it could be, for all intents and purposes, this thing could be 1,000 tons. of rock shipped across the Pacific Ocean, right? And each rock weighing several tons, 15 to 20 tons, right? I don't know, right? An understanding of civil and structural engineering to make the corners L-shaped blocks to prevent spreading. I don't know about you, but that's impressive. And I don't know of too many locations in Polynesia that can claim that. Look at the rocks here. Right? Imagine 1,000 tons of this shipped hundreds of miles. Right? Let's be precise here. Let's be precise here. We're going to ask our digital assistant, Grok. Distance of Tonga Tapu to Uvea. So 882 kilometers, 548 miles. So just under 1,000 kilometers. Yeah, ruins don't matter, guys. Ruins don't, it's not a big deal. Don't talk to me about your ruins. Coming from the people who have no ruins to back up their position. Of course you would diminish the ruins. Right? Oh yeah, it is called Namoala. So in this study, the interesting thing that they discover here is portions of the J20, right, is built on the reclaimed land that the Tu'ihatakalaua had possessed. And then here the Namoala is built 100% on reclaimed land. So says, note the addition of a soil layer used to hold the slabs, J21 in green, and the old lagoon edge, dark red. Right? This is where the dark red area is where the lagoon ended. And then the additional soil over here for filling, because this was all reclaimed land from the lagoon, from the ocean. So they do the studies here on the profile, geochemical analysis of the carbonate crust and the limestone flake from J20 indicated that the cemented crust is limestone debris, which was produced by shaping the tomb blocks. Well, I'm not sure why I had that highlighted here. See if there's anything else I have highlighted. Well, looks like that may be it. That may be the majority of the data here that I have highlighted. So partially buried work limestone block recovered from the South Quarry area due to thickness. The block was probably intended to be used in the second tier. And the transverse fracture said, okay. So it looks like, see, and this is the other thing too. There's this large block that looks like it was going to be used on the second tier. So they brought these unfinished, looks like they brought the unfinished pieces of stone, brought them there, finished doing the work on it before they installed it. And this block was not used because it fractured, right? And that's the other thing too. You think that just because it's a big rock that it won't fracture. These things break, and you're transporting it hundreds of miles, almost 1,000 kilometers. And if you don't know how to handle it correctly, you don't know how to transport it properly, things break, and then it's a wasted effort, right? Imagine all the risk, the time, and the resources to get the rock there. And if you break it, mishandle it, things don't go well. Says Ulaki Mata the First, the 29th Tu'itonga, reputed to be buried at Lapaha in either J20 or J21 in Samoa Manua Island, or he was lost at sea, and J20 tomb was built at his memorial. That was kind of a news to me. I didn't grow up with a lot of history of Urakimata or Terea going missing. That's not what we understand. The interesting thing too is you notice buried in La Paja or in Manua, right? One of the reasons why that may be the case is because oral history says that Kaulfo Nua Fekai, he's the one who establishes the Tu'i Hatakalaua with his younger brother. He moves to Ha'amoa, and his mother, according to oral history, was a Tu'i Manua Fefine. Because remember, in Ha'amoa, the females can carry the title. That's not the case in Tonga. Tonga, that's very rare, if hardly ever happened, because it's usually father to son, father to son. That was the traditional thing, especially with titles. That it says that he was born, that Urakimata may have been buried in Manua, and that may be because they inherited the Tu'i Manua title. Now, that is a reason why you would explain why the Tu'i Manua was so close with the Tu'i Tonga. Because it's the same family. It's the same group. You aren't going to go and harass your close relatives, right? Like that's not how ancient Tongans functioned. Once again, the oral history in La Paja is that it was primarily brought, the building itself of the Paepae Telea was by people from Ha'amoa. However, with the oral history, it could have been the people from Uvea who did the shipping, right? Where this is how you divide labor and responsibility between the different island groups. You say, Ha'amoa, you come, you're going to work on the stone that's delivered. Uvea, you guys are going to cut the stone in Uvea and ship it down to La Paja, and then let our Samoan brothers work on the stone, shape them, and put them in place. Once again, there are several difficulties in reconciling the traditional history of the land reclamation and construction of J20, the Paepae Telea, by the 29th Paramount Urakimata first. Although traditions place land reclamation at the time of the 24th Tu'i Tonga, any landfill would have to be removed in order to build J20 if it was constructed by Urakimata the first. Second, placing J20 tomb on the reclaimed land already occupied by a junior chiefly line makes little sense given the spatial separation of chiefly lineages, with the Tu'i Tonga in the east and the Tu'i Hatakalaua in the west. Remember the coastline? The Tu'i Hatakalaua had to make their own land, and the Tu'i Tonga remained on their own. And then yet it's strange, the Tu'i Hatakalaua the Tu'i Tonga decides to build the Paepae Telea on Tu'i Hatakalaaua's land. It is more probable, given the consistent dating results, that J20 was built when the entire area was used by the Tu'i Tonga and the spatial division occurred later, leaving the J20 and J21 tombs in an area occupied by the junior paramount. So that's one explanation. Oral history says that it was built by Urakimata or Telea. That's why it's called Paepae or Telea. After coming back and the Tu'i Hatakalaua being in place. And so they're just trying to navigate that and trying to understand why the Tu'i Tonga would have built it. Devi Tafale's response is the Tu'i Tonga is back on Tongatapu and wants to just reinstate. He is in charge, right? The Tu'i Hatakalaua has had a 200-300 years to establish their role as the political, administrative, and military decision maker. But the Tu'i Tonga comes back and builds his Paepae Telea on Tu'i Hatakalaua reclaimed land, just to validate and to remind everyone that the Tu'i Tonga is back and the Tu'i Tonga is the supreme ruler over the Tongan Empire. The effort needed to extract the L-shaped limestone block is not known, but must have been significant, as Speneman records that the removal of 0.04 meters of coral limestone during pit digging at La Paja took 2 men with metal tools 4 hours. Right? So 4.4 cubic feet meters of stone, that's nothing. Right? And trying to build out these L-shaped things with modern tools, right? 4 hours to do that. Now imagine with more primitive tools and how much people would have taken. A lot. And not just to shape it, but to load it onto the Cadia, ship it across the ocean, deep ocean voyage, and then unload it, transport it to working space, cut it, shape it, then put it into its final resting place. The royal tombs of the Tuitonga are sacred structures, and when quarried, the fresh surfaces of the J20 blocks would have been highly reflective, as limestones typically have a solar reflective index. A now buried surface of yellow-white limestone construction debris extending at least 60 meters to the west of J20 might represent a plaza or courtyard, suggesting that the tomb was meant to be viewed by canoes entering the Fanga'uta Lagoon. That's the other thing too. I think I read a study once when I was still in college by a surveyor from Colorado State or Colorado University, and he went and did surveys, geographic locational surveys of all the langis, and he came to the conclusion that if you cleared all the trees in that area in front of the tombs facing the lagoon, that it would be a majestic sight. And then now you add, it would have been a highly reflective, a glowing sight to see the white limestone reflecting the sunlight as you're coming in to Fanga'uta Lagoon, to the capital of the Tongan Empire. And that totally makes sense, right? You go into Rome, when you go into the capital of a major empire or civilization, the capital is decked out. And it looks like it was intended that the langis were elevated and were designed to give that wow factor when you came into the lagoon, to bring your tribute to the Tuitonga, whether it's the Inasi or to the the Tuitonga, which was the Polo Polo, or bring the Inasi to the Tuihatakalaua, later the Tuikanukupolu. But these things were not just like, hey, build me a big langi right here. It's like, no, they were like, we gotta make people know that when they come and visit, there's a wow factor, and that they recognize they are now at the capital, right? Geochemical analysis of stone tools recovered from J20 and from the north and the south quarries identified volcanic material from central Tonga, Ewa, Samoa, and Fiji. So once again, these tools are from throughout Polynesia. The presence of stone tools from these islands previously thought to reflect the political connections of Urakimata, who was traditionally known to have had a chiefly wife from Samoa and a daughter who married a Fijian chief. The growth of the tributary base by the time of Urakimata suggested by the sourcing results match a view that the polity reached its greatest extent after conquest warfare of neighboring islands by the 24th Tuitonga, prior to state collapse after 1790. So once again, 1790, that's right around where Europeans are starting to come in to Polynesia, right? They're seeing the Tongan / Polynesian Empire as a fractured and declining empire, right? The new early age of J20 indicates that this view of state development is wrong. and that long-distance voyaging, strategic marriage alliances, and impressive monumental architecture were a feature of the early Tongan state. And that seems to make more sense with a lot of the oral history. A lot of Tonga's oral history is not driven by great battles or wars. It's more about marriages, alliances, family, building unity, right? Following one's duty. There are sprinkling of war and so forth, but that was not the primary tool for building of the Polynesian or Tongan empire. Getting here to the conclusion. So we'll read through this. Looks like that's the last section here. And it says, such conditions supported the emergence of highly organized core polities, right? In some instances, dominated entire regions and through strategic outposts, expanded their influence to the surrounding periphery. That's the other thing that's interesting. There are structures at specific locations, Uvea Futuna, specific locations in Ha'amoa. We're now looking at Cook Islands. Some areas in the Cook Islands have structures that are credited to the Tongans. And looking at other structures, how they were built in Ha'amoa, Uvea and Futuna, the Marais and the Tapu Tapu Atea, all those seem to have the fingerprints of the Tu'itonga, and we'll get to our Eastern brothers and sisters at some time, but that's kind of where my mind goes when I read this. One of the poorly resolved issues about the rise of complex entities relates to state formation and the specific mechanisms and length of time required to create a centralized political entity from smaller autonomous political units. Another thing that we discussed with some of our guests and in some of the discussions that we had is everywhere throughout Polynesia was decentralized power. Only one place had centralized power, which was Tonga, with the Tu'itonga. And that's what they're saying here. A challenge is, how were they able to do this widespread, all these small islands, right? And to create stability and structure. And it is that you intermarry, you have technological advantage through your navy, right? You have a advantage of consolidating resources throughout Polynesia. And if you really needed to go to war, you could consolidate manpower. You've already shown the ability to consolidate labor for building structures. That's the same process for building armies, right? Bring labor or soldiers together, warriors together to attack. So that's how Tonga was able to do it. Decentralized power in pockets throughout Polynesia and only centralized with the Tu'itonga. A second issue relevant to the Tongan case relates to state power and whether archaic states once formed needed centuries to acquire control over the landscapes and people of the titular state, or whether polities exerted control from the outset over a wide range of human and material resources within state borders, right? They're trying to understand, how was Tonga able to do this? Did they do this in a very short amount of time? Or did they do this over centuries? They're just kind of having a discussion on that. It's like, that's a fair question, right? Were all the islands found right next to each other? Well, it seems like Tonga, Fiji, Samoa, Tokelau, Niue, Uvea, Futuna, that seems to be one of the quicker waves of settlement. And then there's a second wave that goes east. Interesting. I don't know what the exact answer is for that. Tongan tradition supported by new archaeological data, and that's important. That's what makes Tonga's case so compelling, and the Tu'itonga case compelling. Traditions, oral history, not just from Tonga, but other parts of Polynesia, and archaeological data. That's what you need to have a compelling story or position. Tongan traditions supported by new archaeological data assert the critical changes to the political system and management of land were made just 3 lineal generations of Tuitonga. The 10th Momo, 11th Tuitatui, and 12th Talatama. In this short period, the first stone structures were built at Heketa. Then, after the move to La Paja, much larger projects were begun, including limestone cut ditch system, lagoon reclamation, and the construction of the remarkable J20 tomb that marked the state center. The new architectural innovations, especially those involving the quarrying of coral limestone, materialized the apex status of the Tuitonga at a scale not seen previously. Recognition that Pai Telea is probably the first of the royal tombs to be built at La Paja demonstrates that the early Tongan state could command a significant workforce, while volcanic stone tools sourced to Fiji and Samoa, and the presence of Tongan fortifications in East Fiji and Uvea indicate early long-distance interaction in warfare. So they are taking the position that there was significant growth of the Polynesian Empire between 3 generations. That's like what? If you give them 50 years of rule, 50 to 75 years? Don't know what the lifespan is, but you say what, typically 25 to 30 years. So in 90 years? Interesting. Wondering, because it seems like Western Polynesia was one wave, and maybe that's where the second wave into Eastern Polynesia starts. I don't know. But they're making the claim here that based on the evidence they've seen in their paper, that's where they see the tremendous growth in technology and in resources. Interesting. Anyways, looking at the time, we're hitting the 2-hour block. We're scheduled on time. We're going to finish on time as we kind of expressed here. But we've covered this before, but we covered it again to give receipts to those who ask for receipts. And you know what's funny? The people who ask for the most receipts are the ones who bring the least amount of receipts. And when they bring receipts, we look into the receipts and all we find are oofy pits, right? Just bedtime stories with no tie to reality. So with that being said, want to thank all our viewers, all of our listeners, all the support, all the likes, all the shares, all the subscriptions, those who pay to be paying members, those who contribute through super thanks, super chats, and contribute. It goes a long way. We really appreciate it. We look forward to having Mr. Aotearoa return to the program once he comes off his long vacation. And like I said, I have an upcoming episode I'm dying to share with everyone, but waiting for Mr. Aotearoa to return to his post, the southern part of the Polynesian Empire, and continue here at the efforts. Thank you, everyone. Appreciate it. As always, we invite all viewers and listeners to don't be afraid to ask the hard questions, be bold, and till next time, peace.